The sun was setting over the ancient land of Canaan, painting the hills in shades of amber and rose. The air grew cooler as evening descended, bringing with it that particular stillness that comes when day surrenders to night. In this quiet hour, a man named Jacob walked alone across the wilderness, his sandaled feet carrying him farther and farther from everything he had ever known. This is a story from the book of Genesis, told gently for rest and peaceful sleep. Let the words settle over you like the evening light settling over those ancient hills, as we follow Jacob on his journey into the wilderness. Jacob was traveling northward, away from his father's tents in Beersheba, away from his mother's voice, away from the well-worn paths of his childhood. He walked with the weight of recent events pressing upon his shoulders, though the land itself seemed peaceful enough. The rocky terrain stretched out before him, dotted with scattered thorns and the occasional terebinth tree, casting long shadows in the fading light. This was not a journey Jacob had planned with joy or anticipation. He was leaving home because staying had become impossible. His brother Esau had made threats against his life, and his mother Rebekah had urged him to flee until his brother's anger cooled. So Jacob walked, each step taking him farther from the only home he had known, toward the distant land of Haran, where his mother's family still dwelt. The landscape through which Jacob traveled was ancient even then. These hills had witnessed countless footsteps, countless journeys. Abraham, his grandfather, had walked these same paths decades before, following the call of God from Mesopotamia into this land of promise. Isaac, Jacob's father, had been born in this land and had spent his quiet life moving between wells and pastures, tending flocks and seeking water. Now it was Jacob's turn to make a journey, though his was born not of divine calling, but of family strife and his own deceptive choices. He had tricked his aging father and cheated his brother out of the blessing that belonged to the firstborn. The scriptures do not tell us in detail what he felt, whether justified or guilty, triumphant or ashamed. We know only that he walked alone into the growing darkness. The sun continued its descent, and Jacob realized he would need to find a place to spend the night. There were no villages nearby, no relatives to offer hospitality, no inn where a traveler might find shelter. The wilderness did not concern itself with human needs. It simply was, rocks and earth and sky, existing in their own timeless rhythm. Jacob came to a certain place as the last light was fading from the sky. The scriptures call it simply a certain place, as if to emphasize that it seemed ordinary, unmarked, distinguished by nothing in particular. It was not a shrine, not a city, not a landmark known for any significance. It was merely where Jacob found himself when darkness fell and he could walk no farther. The place was rocky, as much of that hill country was. Stones of various sizes lay scattered across the ground, remnants of ancient geological processes that had shaped the land over countless ages. Some stones were small, others large enough to serve as primitive furniture or building material. Shepherds sometimes stacked these stones into rough walls to pen their flocks at night. Jacob gathered what he needed for the night. In that era, travelers did not carry elaborate camping equipment. They brought what they could wear or carry: a cloak, perhaps a small amount of food and water, a staff for walking and defense. Everything else had to be borrowed from the land itself. He took one of the stones from that place and positioned it carefully. This would be his pillow, a hard and unyielding rest for his head, but sufficient. In that time and culture, people were accustomed to such simplicity. Comfort was not assumed, and luxury was rare. Even in his father's tents, Jacob would have slept on the ground, perhaps with woven mats or animal skins for cushioning, but nothing like the soft beds that later civilizations would invent. The stone pillow speaks to us across the centuries of Jacob's situation. He was vulnerable, alone, without the comforts of home. He had no servant to prepare his resting place, no family member to keep watch, no familiar surroundings to provide security. The darkness deepened around him. In that age before artificial light, nighttime brought a darkness more complete than most of us will ever experience. There were no distant city lights creating a glow on the horizon, no street lamps, no electric bulbs. When the sun set, the darkness was total, broken only by starlight and perhaps the moon, if it was in the right phase of its cycle. Jacob lay down on the hard ground with the stone beneath his head. Perhaps he pulled his cloak around himself against the cooling air. The night sounds of the wilderness would have surrounded him. The occasional call of a night bird, the rustle of some small creature moving through the brush, the whisper of wind across the rocks. These were not the comforting sounds of home, but neither were they particularly threatening. They were simply the sounds of a world going about its ancient rhythms, indifferent to one man's presence. We do not know what thoughts occupied Jacob's mind as he lay there in the darkness. Did he think of his mother Rebekah, who had helped him execute the deception? Did he think of his father Isaac, old and blind, who had blessed him thinking he was Esau? Did he worry about his brother's anger, or about the long road ahead, the uncertain future? The scriptures do not tell us these things. They simply tell us that Jacob lay down in that place to sleep. And sometimes the most profound moments come not when we are striving and planning and controlling, but when we finally stop, when we lay our heads down and surrender to rest. And so Jacob slept. His body relaxed into the hard ground. His breathing slowed and deepened. His consciousness released its grip on the events of the day, on worries about tomorrow, on regrets about yesterday. He drifted into that mysterious state that visits us all each night, when the mind wanders in strange countries and time loses its ordinary meaning. In his sleep, Jacob began to dream. Dreams are curious things, neither entirely real nor entirely unreal, existing in some intermediate space between waking consciousness and the deep unknown. Ancient peoples often saw dreams as significant, as potential messages from the divine realm, or as windows into truths that the waking mind could not perceive. Jacob's dream that night was such a dream. It came to him with vividness and clarity, with images so striking that he would remember them for the rest of his life, would tell the story to his children and grandchildren, would mark the very spot where he slept as a holy place. In his dream, Jacob saw a ladder. The Hebrew word used in the ancient text might also be translated as stairway or ramp, some kind of structure that connected earth to heaven. This was not a small household ladder for reaching a roof or picking fruit from a tree. This was something magnificent, something impossible, something that stretched from the very ground where Jacob lay sleeping all the way up into the heavens themselves. The ladder was set up on the earth, its base firmly planted in the ordinary dirt and rock of that certain place where Jacob had stopped for the night, but its top reached to heaven, extending upward beyond the clouds, beyond the sky, beyond the realm of birds and weather, into the dwelling place of God Himself. It bridged two realms that normally existed in complete separation, the earthly and the divine, the mortal and the eternal. And on this ladder, Jacob saw angels. The messengers of God were ascending and descending, moving up and down with purpose and order. They were not floating randomly or flying about in chaotic patterns. They were walking on the ladder, climbing its rungs or steps, engaged in orderly traffic between heaven and earth. Some were going up, perhaps carrying the prayers and concerns of earth to the throne room of heaven. Others were coming down, perhaps bearing the blessings and provisions and purposes of heaven into the earthly realm. The vision was striking in its orderliness. This was not a chaotic supernatural event, not a wild display of divine power breaking through in destructive force. It was more like watching workers going about their assigned tasks, like seeing travelers on a busy road, each with a destination and purpose. There was rhythm to it, pattern, a sense of ongoing activity that had been happening long before Jacob arrived and would continue long after he departed. The angels themselves are not described in detail. The Bible does not tell us what they looked like, whether they had wings or appeared as humans, whether they glowed with light or appeared solid and earthly. The focus is on their activity, ascending and descending, connecting heaven and earth through their comings and goings. In the ancient world, angels were understood as messengers and servants of God, beings who existed in the spiritual realm, but could interact with the physical world when necessary. They were not usually visible to human eyes, but occasionally, in special moments, the veil between worlds would thin. Jacob's dream was such a moment, a glimpse into the usually hidden reality of heaven's constant interaction with earth. As Jacob watched this remarkable vision, he became aware of a presence at the top of the ladder. The Lord Himself stood above it. This was not merely a dream about angels, not just a vision of cosmic architecture. This was an encounter with the living God, the one who had revealed Himself to Abraham and Isaac, the one who had made covenant promises to Jacob's family. The Lord spoke to Jacob, and His words came clearly, despite the dreamlike state of the experience. These were not the vague impressions or confused messages that often characterize ordinary dreams. These words were distinct, memorable, weighty with meaning and promise. God identified Himself first. "I am the Lord," He said, "the God of Abraham your grandfather, and the God of Isaac your father." Jacob was not encountering some unknown deity, some local spirit of the wilderness. This was the same God who had called Abraham to leave Mesopotamia generations ago, the God who had promised Abraham descendants and land, the God who had renewed those promises to Isaac. Then God made a promise about the land. "The land on which you lie," He told Jacob, "I will give to you and to your offspring." Jacob was sleeping on rocky, uncultivated ground in the middle of the wilderness, far from any city or settlement. Yet God claimed this very soil, this particular patch of earth, as part of the promise. Not just this spot, but the entire land. The promise that had been given to Abraham and Isaac was now being confirmed to Jacob. God continued speaking about Jacob's descendants. They would be like the dust of the earth, he said, spreading out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. This was language of abundance, of multiplication beyond counting. Jacob, who was traveling alone through the wilderness, fleeing from his brother without wife or child, was being promised a multitude of descendants who would fill the land and spread in every direction. More than that, God said, all the families of the earth would be blessed through Jacob and his offspring. This was the great promise that had first been given to Abraham, that his descendants would somehow be a blessing not just to themselves but to all peoples, to every family on earth. It was now being passed down to Jacob. He was part of a story much larger than his own life, a purpose that would ripple out through generations and across the world. But God was not finished. He added a promise of immediate personal significance to Jacob's current situation. "Behold," the Lord said, "I am with you." These simple words carried enormous weight. Jacob was not alone after all. The God who stood at the top of the ladder, the God who oversaw the angels ascending and descending, the God who made promises about land and descendants and worldwide blessing. This God was with Jacob. Right there in the wilderness, in his vulnerability, in his exile. God promised to keep Jacob wherever he went. This was a promise of protection, of preservation, of divine watchfulness. Jacob was embarking on a long journey into unknown territory, and he would face many challenges and dangers in the years ahead. But God would be keeping him through it all. And God promised to bring Jacob back to this land. His exile was not permanent. His journey was not a one-way trip into oblivion. There would be a return, a homecoming. God said, "I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." This was a commitment to see the whole story through to completion, to remain faithful until every promise was fulfilled. The words echoed in the dream, soaking into Jacob's sleeping consciousness with their weight and their wonder. Here, in this ordinary place, on this uncomfortable night, God had met him, not to scold him for his deception, not to condemn him for his failures, but to make promises, to offer reassurance, to claim him as part of the covenant family. The vision of the ladder with its ascending and descending angels continued. The image represented something profound about the nature of reality itself. Heaven and earth were not as separate as they might seem. The spiritual realm and the physical realm were not isolated from each other. There was traffic between them, communication, interaction. Where Jacob slept, in that certain place that had seemed so ordinary, was actually a place where heaven and earth met. The angels on the ladder suggested constant divine activity in the world, even when humans were unaware of it. God's messengers were always ascending and descending, always carrying out his purposes, always connecting the eternal realm with the temporal. The universe was not abandoned by its creator, not left to run on its own. It was attended to, cared for, infused with divine presence and purpose. As the dream continued, Jacob remained in that space between waking and sleeping, experiencing the vision with a quality of reality that transcended ordinary consciousness. This was more than mental imagery. This was encounter, revelation, meeting. The night wore on. Stars wheeled slowly across the sky, marking the ancient and unchanging patterns that had greeted every night since the creation of the world. The wilderness maintained its patient silence. The stone beneath Jacob's head remained hard and unyielding. But in the interior landscape of Jacob's sleeping mind, everything had changed. Heaven had opened. God had spoken. Promises had been made. Eventually, the vision faded. The dream ran its course. Jacob began to stir, moving from deep sleep toward waking consciousness. The angels on the ladder receded from his awareness. The presence of God at the top of the ladder withdrew from immediate perception. The boundary between sleeping and waking, between vision and ordinary reality, began to reassert itself. Jacob woke up. His eyes opened to the early morning light. The sun had not yet fully risen, but the darkness had lifted enough to see the landscape around him. The rocks, the scattered vegetation, the rolling hills, everything looked much as it had the evening before. It was still a certain place in the wilderness, still ordinary in its appearance. But Jacob's perception had been transformed. He sat up, fully awake now, and the realization hit him with stunning force. "Surely the Lord is in this place," he said to himself, speaking aloud in his wonder, "and I did not know it." That phrase captures something essential about Jacob's experience. God had been present in that place before Jacob arrived. The ladder, in some sense, had always been there. The angels had been ascending and descending. The divine presence had been hovering over that ground. But Jacob had not known it when he lay down to sleep. He had seen only rocks and wilderness, only a difficult place to spend an uncomfortable night. Now he knew differently. The ordinariness of the place had been revealed as incomplete perception. What seemed common was actually sacred. What appeared empty was actually full of divine presence. What looked like mere wilderness was actually a gateway between worlds. Jacob felt something rising in him that was beyond wonder, something approaching fear, though not the terror of threat or danger. It was the fear that comes from encountering something far greater than yourself, something holy and powerful and utterly beyond human control or comprehension. It was the appropriate human response to the divine presence. Awe, reverence, a kind of trembling recognition. "How awesome is this place," Jacob said. The word carries the sense of something that inspires profound reverence mixed with fear, something majestic and overwhelming and deserving of the deepest respect. Then Jacob named what he had experienced. "This is none other than the house of God," he declared. The place where he had stopped to sleep, chosen simply because nightfall had found him there, was actually God's dwelling place, God's house, a point of divine residence on earth. But he did not stop there. "This is the gate of heaven," he continued. Not just a house, but a gate, an entrance, an opening, a portal. The ladder he had seen in his dream represented something real about this location. Here, heaven was accessible. Here, the barrier between the divine realm and the earthly realm was thin, permeable, capable of being crossed. The early morning light grew stronger as Jacob sat there, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. Everything had changed, yet nothing had changed. The rocks were still rocks. The wilderness was still wilderness. But Jacob would never see them the same way again, knowing now that God could be present anywhere, that the sacred could break through into the ordinary at any moment. Jacob rose early, energized despite what must have been an uncomfortable night's sleep. He took the stone that had served as his pillow, that hard and uncomfortable rock, and he set it up as a pillar. Setting up stones as pillars or monuments was an ancient practice, a way of marking significant events or places. These stone markers would remain long after the person who set them up had moved on, silent witnesses to important moments. They served as reminders, as teaching tools, as permanent records carved into the landscape itself. Jacob did more than just set up the stone. He took oil and poured it on the top of the pillar. This was an act of consecration, of setting something apart for sacred purposes. Oil was valuable and had multiple uses in the ancient world, but when poured out on an altar or pillar or person, it signified dedication to God, marking something as holy. The oil would have run down the sides of the stone, darkening its surface, leaving a visible mark. This was not a subtle gesture, not a private mental commitment. This was a public declaration, made visible in the physical world, that something significant had happened here. Then Jacob gave the place a new name. Previously, it had been called Luz, apparently the name of a nearby city or the general area. But Jacob renamed it Bethel, which means house of God. This name would stick. Throughout the rest of biblical history, this place would be known as Bethel, and the name itself would tell the story. This is where Jacob discovered that he was sleeping at the gate of heaven, where God revealed himself and made promises. Naming is an act of power and recognition in the biblical narrative. When someone names something, they are asserting authority over it, defining it, establishing its identity. Jacob's naming of Bethel was a declaration to anyone who would come after him. This place has significance. This is where God met a wanderer in the night. This is where heaven and earth connected. But Jacob was not finished. Standing there in the growing light of morning beside the oil-anointed pillar, he made a vow. Vows were serious matters in the ancient world, solemn promises made before God, binding commitments that carried great weight. Jacob's vow began with conditional language, an if-then structure. If God will be with me, Jacob said, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Perhaps we should understand Jacob's words not as bargaining or showing lack of faith, but as expressing the natural human response to overwhelming divine promises. Jacob had received extraordinary commitments from God in the night, but now, in the sober light of morning, he was acknowledging his dependence on those promises actually being fulfilled. If God will be with me, Jacob said, echoing God's own promise, I am with you. He was saying, in effect, if that promise proves real in his actual experience as he traveled and faced challenges and lived his life, and will keep me in this way that I go. Again, echoing God's promise to keep him wherever he went. Jacob was traveling into unknown territory, facing uncertain dangers. He needed keeping, needed protection, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. These were the basics of survival, the minimum necessary for life. Jacob was not asking for wealth or luxury, just for sustenance and protection from the elements, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. This was the heart of it. God had promised to bring Jacob back to this land. Jacob wanted to return safely, to come home again, to be reconciled eventually with his family. Then the Lord shall be my God. This was Jacob's way of saying that he would give himself fully to this relationship, would acknowledge God's lordship completely, would worship and serve the God who had proved faithful to his promises. Jacob continued his vow, making further commitments. "This stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house." The stone would remain as a permanent marker, a sacred site, a place where God's presence had been revealed. "And of all that you give me," Jacob vowed, "I will give a full tenth to you." This was a commitment to return a portion of all blessings back to God, to acknowledge that everything came from the divine hand, to live with generosity and gratitude. A tenth was a meaningful portion, significant enough to be sacrificial, regular enough to be a discipline. The vow completed, Jacob prepared to continue his journey. The sun was rising fully now. The day was beginning. He had miles to travel, weeks of walking ahead of him before he would reach Haran. But he would walk differently now than he had walked yesterday. He had left Beersheba as a fugitive, alone and afraid. He would travel northward now as someone who had encountered God, who had received promises, who knew himself to be part of a larger story. Jacob gathered his few belongings. He took one last look at the stone pillar, gleaming with oil in the morning sun. He surveyed the landscape around him, this certain place that now had a name and a meaning. Then he set his face toward the north and resumed his journey. The land stretched out before him, much as it had the day before. The hills rolled away into the distance. The path was still rough and uncertain, but the landscape was different now, or rather, Jacob's perception of it had changed. He walked through a world where heaven and earth were connected, where God's presence was real, where promises had been made and a future had been secured. As Jacob walked, perhaps he thought about the vision of the ladder. That image would stay with him for the rest of his life. Angels ascending and descending, constant traffic between heaven and earth, the spiritual realm intersecting with the physical in ways that were usually invisible, but always real. The hours passed as Jacob traveled. Morning turned to midday, midday to afternoon. His feet carried him farther from Bethel, farther into the journey that would shape the rest of his life. But he carried Bethel with him in his memory and in his understanding of reality. That certain place had become, in his experience, the center of the world, the point where everything made sense. In the years that followed, Jacob would face many challenges. He would work for his uncle Laban, enduring deception and hardship. He would marry and have children. He would accumulate flocks and possessions. He would eventually return to Canaan, facing the fearful prospect of meeting his brother Esau again after all those years. He would wrestle with a mysterious figure at the Jabbok River and receive a new name, Israel. He would experience both joy and sorrow, success and loss, as all humans do. But through it all, the memory of Bethel would remain with him. The vision of the ladder, the voice of God making promises, the realization that the Lord was present in that place, though he had not known it, these would be anchor points for his faith, reminders that he was not navigating life alone, that his story was caught up in a much larger purpose. The stone pillar at Bethel would remain as well, a physical marker in the landscape, telling its silent story to anyone who passed by. This was where Jacob slept and dreamed, where he anointed a stone with oil, where he discovered that the ordinary place where he had stopped for the night was actually the house of God and the gate of heaven. Generations later, people would still speak of Bethel. It would become a well-known location in the geography of the Promised Land. Other significant events would happen there. The name itself would become almost proverbial. Bethel, house of God, the place where heaven and earth met. But perhaps the deepest significance of Jacob's experience at Bethel is not about that particular location, but about the larger truth it revealed. If God could be present in that certain place, that ordinary stretch of wilderness, that uncomfortable spot where Jacob stopped because night had fallen and he could walk no farther, then God could be present anywhere. If heaven's gate could open there, it could open anywhere. The ladder connecting heaven and earth was not limited to that one location. It represented something fundamental about God's relationship with the world. The divine realm and the human realm, though distinct, were not separated by an impassable barrier. Angels were always ascending and descending, though usually invisible. God's purposes were always at work, though often hidden. Jacob learned that night that he was never truly alone, that God's presence attended him even when he was unaware of it, that promises had been made to him before he could do anything to earn them, that his life had purpose and direction, even when he felt lost and displaced. These truths would sustain him through the long years ahead. When the journey grew difficult, when relationships proved complicated, when outcomes seemed uncertain, Jacob could return in his memory to that night at Bethel. He could remember that he was being kept, that God was with him, that the story was moving toward its intended conclusion. As the sun set on this day of revelation and resumed travel, as Jacob made camp again in another wilderness location and lay down to sleep, perhaps he looked at whatever stone he used for a pillow with new eyes. Perhaps he wondered if God would speak again, if another vision would come, or perhaps he simply slept, resting in the promises that had been made, trusting that God was keeping watch, believing that the angels were ascending and descending even in the darkness, that heaven's ladder connected earth to the divine realm every night, in every place. Whether humans perceived it or not, the stars came out above Jacob, the same stars that had shone on Abraham and Isaac, the same stars that would shine on his children and his children's children for generations to come. The wilderness grew quiet around him. The night embraced him with its darkness and its mystery. And somewhere, invisible to human eyes, the ladder stood firm, connecting heaven and earth, with angels ascending and descending, carrying the prayers of earth upward and bringing the blessings of heaven downward, maintaining the constant traffic between the divine and human realms, keeping the promise alive. Jacob slept, secure in the promises he had received, part of a story much larger than himself, connected to the purposes of God through the ladder that linked heaven and earth. And the God who had spoken to him at Bethel kept watch through the night, faithful to his word, present though unseen. The land of Canaan stretched out in the darkness, ancient and patient, waiting for the promises to be fulfilled, waiting for Jacob's descendants to fill it as numerous as the dust of the earth, waiting for the blessing to spread to all the families of the earth. But that was still future, still unfolding, still working itself out through the years and generations to come. For now, There was just the night and the stars, and Jacob sleeping in the wilderness, and God keeping watch, and the invisible ladder connecting heaven and earth, and the angels ascending and descending, and the promises hanging in the air like benedictions. The story that began with Abraham, that continued through Isaac, that now included Jacob, was moving forward toward its appointed end. The promises were secure. The covenant was being passed down. Heaven and earth were connected. And in the quiet hours of the night, in the wilderness places where humans traveled and dreamed and received visions, God was present, speaking words of comfort and commitment, revealing that no place was too ordinary to become a house of God, that no moment was too common to become a gate of heaven. This is the story of Jacob's dream at Bethel, a story of rest and revelation, of promises made in the darkness, of discovering divine presence in ordinary places, of realizing that heaven and earth are closer than we think, that we are never as alone as we feel, that even in our times of exile and uncertainty and fear, God is with us, keeping watch, keeping promises, keeping faith. May this story bring you rest tonight as you lay your head down in your own certain place, as you trust in promises greater than yourself, as you remember that angels ascend and descend, whether you see them or not, as you rest in the knowledge that heaven's ladder stands firm, connecting the divine to the human, bringing God's presence into every ordinary moment, every wilderness place, every nighttime hour when we close our eyes and sleep. Rest now in the promises. Rest in the presence. Rest in the peace of knowing that you too are being kept, that God is with you, that the story is still unfolding toward its good end, that the ladder still stands, and heaven still reaches down to touch the earth where you lie. Rest, and may your sleep be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your waking be filled with the wonder that Jacob felt when he realized that surely the Lord was in that place, though he had not known it. Amen, and good night.